The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is in Paris for talks with the French President Emmanuel Macron. It's the first Anglo-French summit in 5 years. The leaders are expected to discuss a range of issues. Illegal immigration via migrant boat crossings in the Channel is likely to top the British agenda. But other primary concerns for both leaders are defence cooperation, the Western response to Russia's conflict in Ukraine, as well as challenges posed by China. They'll also be looking to reset the Anglo-French relationship, which deteriorated after Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield has the report.
Friends again. Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron have met before. They like each other. Now they want to show that whatever the divisions of the last few years, France and the UK are back together and with a programme. For the UK, high on the to-do list is stopping the migrant boats across the Channel. The French are already helping, with patrols paid for partly by British money, but the flow keeps coming. More than 45,000 people entered the UK via Channel crossings last year, up from about 300 in 2018. So far this year, around 3,000 people have arrived on small boats, but the two governments claim their joint work has stopped a similar number from making the journey.
It will cost money, it has cost money, and of course we'll be negotiating how we fund that joint work to prevent those migration attempts across the Channel. It's right and proper that we do, and of course we will be spending money in the future. The details of that will be part of what we discussed today.
Under Rishi Sunak's predecessors, cooperation was hampered by the sharp downturn in relations. France thought Boris Johnson whipped up anti-French feeling for electoral reasons.
Thank you.
And the low point was reached when Liz Truss was unable even to call France a friend. This is the first summit between the French and British leaders since 2018. Before that, in more normal times, they were happening once a year. Now both countries agree it's time to reset the Entente Cordiale. Yes, Brexit is a fact and a complication, but there's too much at stake for renewed friendship not to be a top priority. Above all, there's Ukraine. France and the UK have not always seen entirely eye to eye on the war, but now Europe's two major military powers say they need to project an image of total unity to show Russia that they're serious.
I think we have a lot in common, and also because we're a permanent member of the Security Council and we're sharing intelligence, and also on Ukraine we are on the same side, and so I think we can rebuild this relationship, and the time is appropriate. Also because Rishi Sunak is probably more pragmatic than his predecessors.
Both France and the UK want to see the last few years as an uncharacteristic hiatus, normal service between the two countries now being resumed. That won't always mean harmony and concord, but cooperation and respect and a few smiles are a good start. Hugh Schofield, BBC News, Paris.
Well, I'm joined now by Francois Heisburg, who is a senior advisor for Europe for the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for joining us here on BBC World News. I wonder first off, what does France want to get out of this relationship?
I think France really does want to get a reset at the bilateral level between London and Paris. As was pointed out a few seconds ago, this is the first meeting in 5 years. The pandemic obviously got into the way, as well as the bad temper between Boris Johnson and President Macron. So it is indeed reset time, but it's a reset back to the old normal, the pre-pandemic normal. It is not viewed as something on which one can build a lot. Simply getting the existing machinery working again, notably the Lancaster House agreements in the field of security and defense, are very much of the essence. What the French will also have noted is the emphasis in the UK government statement about Indo-Pacific, where Britain and France have a lot to do together, and are indeed basically the two European countries which have the ability to project power and influence in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, at the height of the tensions, I remember there was quite a lot of upset over a certain submarine contract. I mean, how closely did the two countries work before the relationship deteriorated on the subject of defence?
The countries have actually never ceased to work together quite well in terms of the nuclear arrangements between France and Britain. That's the quiet part of the agreements, but it's a very important and very long-term one. In the conventional arena, the two armed forces have always been at pains not to let the political climate get into the way. But when it comes to strategy, to high policy in field of security and defense, the politicians have to agree, have to be seen as working together. And that seems to be the promise of the Sunak-Macron meeting. Once again, not something on which one expects a lot to be built upon, but at least back to the fundamentals, back to what we have already built up and which had sort of fallen into disuse during the last few years because of the pandemic, because of Brexit, because of personalities as well, as you pointed out, when it came to Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, the relationship with Macron was not stellar.
Francois, if you don't mind, you don't sound too hopeful when you say, you know, what we have to build on. Realistically then, what are we going to come out of this summit with?
We're going to come out with goodwill and a common agreement not to actually get into each other's way. And hopefully, but that is going to be actually very difficult, certainly in practice, is the topic which is very important to Britain more so than to France, that of the small boats, which, as you know, is a very sensitive topic in the UK. But there one bumps into domestic British politics, one bumps into the problem of how much Rishi Sunak can actually deliver given the state of the Tory party and the uncertainties concerning the general election, which will presumably take place next year. So the French will probably be looking at this summit as a placeholder, a good placeholder, and next year maybe something more forward-looking.
Okay. So you are Senior Advisor for Europe, so I'd like to take the migrant story outside of just France. Is this summit the right place to be talking about a returns policy, or does this really rest on the EU table with Ursula von der Leyen and the member states?
The answer is obviously both, because most of the small boat traffic concerns France and Britain first and foremost. But of course, the EU has a policy on migration, the Schengen countries and so on. So both have to be done. It happens to be dealt with first at this summit because the summit is there. But you're absolutely right. A lot will depend on how Rishi Sunak continues or not to mend fences with the EU in Brussels after the so-called Windsor Agreement on Northern Ireland.
Okay, Francois Hasberg, Senior Advisor for Europe for the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you very much for your time.